The heart monitor flatlined for 3 seconds, long enough for everyone in the room to hear it. Long enough for the nurse to freeze with her hands mid-air. Long enough for the billionaire, standing at the foot of the crib, to forget how to breathe. Someone whispered, "We're losing him." The nursery at the Whitmore estate did not look like a place where babies died. It looked like a magazine spread. Soft cream walls, imported oak floors. A ceiling light shaped like a constellation dimmed to a warm glow. The kind of room designed to convince the world that nothing bad could happen here. And yet in the center of it all, a 5-month-old baby lay still. His chest barely moving. His skin washed in a grayish blue that no amount of money could erase. 18 doctors crowded the room. Not residents, not interns. These were names that carried weight. Heads of departments, authors of textbooks, men and women who flew first class without thinking about it. Their voices overlapped in tight, controlled bursts. Lab values, dosages, time stamps. No panic in their words. Panic lived in their eyes. Pressures dropping again, a nurse said, her voice too calm, the way people sound when they are trying not to break. At the far end of the room, Richard Whitmore stood perfectly still. 62 years old. Silver hair combed back the way it had been for decades. Tailored suit sleeves rolled up without realizing it. He had built companies, dismantled competitors, outlasted 3 recessions, and 1 federal investigation. He had never felt smaller than he did right now, watching a room full of brilliance fail his son. Across from him, his wife Elaine Whitmore sat in a chair she had not left in hours. Her hand clutched the armrest like it was the only thing holding her upright. Her eyes were fixed on the baby, unblinking, as if looking away might be a kind of betrayal. "Run the panel again," one of the doctors said. His badge read, Dr. Samuel Klein, Cleveland Clinic, Cardiology. "We already did," another replied. "Twice." "Then do it a 3rd time." They all knew it would not change anything. They did it anyway. Outside the room, the hallway buzzed with a different kind of tension. Security guards paced in short, sharp steps. Phones vibrated and were silenced. Someone argued in a low voice near the service stairs. The estate had become a sealed world, cut off from the rest of Connecticut, from the rest of the country, from reality itself. At the end of that hallway, near a door most people never used, Ethan Brooks stood with his back against the wall, trying to slow his breathing. He was 18. Tall, lean shoulders, slightly hunched out of habit. He wore a faded work jacket that still smelled faintly of machine oil and pine cleaner. His hands were rough from fixing things that no one wanted to fix themselves. His eyes were sharp, alert, always moving. A lifetime of staying out of the way had taught him how to watch without being seen. Ethan was not supposed to be there. He knew that. Everyone had made that clear many times in many ways that did not require words. The Whitmore estate had rules. Some were written, most were not. You used the service roads. You kept your head down. You did not linger near the main house. You especially did not stand outside the nursery when something had gone wrong. But Ethan had been asked to check a breaker in the east wing earlier that evening. Power fluctuations, old wiring. Nothing unusual, until he heard the alarms. Now he stood there, listening to the sounds bleeding through the heavy door. The beeps, the murmured commands, the sound of someone crying quietly and trying to hide it. His jaw tightened. A security guard noticed him and frowned. "You're not cleared to be here," the man said. Late 40s, broad shoulders, the kind of voice that expected obedience. "I was fixing the panel," Ethan replied. His tone was respectful, steady. "I'm done. I'm leaving." "Do it faster," the guard said, already turning away. Ethan pushed off the wall and walked toward the service exit, his boots barely making a sound on the polished floor. Every step felt heavier than the last. He should have been relieved. He should have gone back to the maintenance shed, texted his mother that he was fine, waited out the night like he always did. Instead, his mind replayed a detail he could not shake. Earlier that week, a delivery had arrived. Not unusual. The Whitmores received deliveries constantly. Art, wine, custom furniture, gifts that arrived with handwritten notes and too much wrapping. Ethan had helped unload it. A wooden crate, light for its size, labeled fragile. Inside a plant. He remembered the leaves, thick, waxy, dark green with pale veins that looked almost painted on. He remembered the gardener joking about how fancy it looked, how it belonged in a museum instead of a nursery. He remembered the sticky residue left on his gloves when he helped move it, how it had taken soap and hot water to get the feeling off his skin. At the time, it had meant nothing. Now standing at the edge of a hallway, where the richest people in the state were watching their child slip away, it meant everything. Ethan reached the service door and stopped. His hand hovered over the handle. He could hear his mother's voice in his head, as clear as if she were standing next to him. "Don't get involved. Don't draw attention. Do your job and come home. That was how you survived." He exhaled slowly. Inside the nursery, Dr. Klein shook his head. "We're missing something," he said. "Not to anyone in particular. This doesn't track. The labs don't match the presentation." Richard Whitmore's voice cut through the room. "Then find what you're missing." Silence followed. Not defiance. Something worse. Uncertainty. Elaine Whitmore finally looked away from her son and met her husband's eyes. "Richard," she said softly, "if he doesn't make it, he will." Richard snapped, then stopped himself. His voice dropped. "He will." The monitor beeped again. Slower now. Back in the hallway, Ethan turned around. He did not run. That would have drawn attention. He walked, calm and deliberate, back toward the nursery door. Each step felt like crossing an invisible line. Each step carried weight. Consequences. He could already see them unfolding. Security hands on his shoulders, questions, accusations, his mother's face when she realized what he had done. He stopped outside the door. Through the narrow glass panel, he could see the room. The doctors, the parents, the crib, and on the windowsill half hidden behind a curtain, the plant. The camera, if there had been one, would have pushed in on Ethan's face in that moment. On the way, his eyes narrowed. On the slight hitch in his breath. On the memory that surfaced without warning. A kitchen table in South Carolina. An old woman's hands stained from soil pointing to a picture in a worn book. "This one is pretty," she had said. "That's how it fools you." Ethan's fingers curled into a fist. Inside the nursery, the baby's heart rate dipped again. Outside, a young man no one expected to matter made a decision that would tear the night open. Ethan stepped through the nursery door, just as a doctor said, "Prep for intubation." The room reacted to him like a foreign object. Conversations stalled. A nurse glanced up, startled, then looked toward security. Someone hissed, "Who let him in here?" Ethan did not answer. He did not look at the people. He looked at the baby. The child's chest fluttered shallow and uneven, like a bird trapped in a box. The monitor gave a thin, irregular chirp that sounded wrong even to ears trained on engines and wiring instead of heartbeats. "Sir," a guard said, already moving, "you need to step back." Ethan raised one hand, palm open, not aggressive, not pleading. "I saw the delivery," he said. His voice surprised him. It did not shake. "Earlier this week. The plant." Dr. Klein turned. His eyes flicked to the windowsill, then back. "Get him out," he said. Clipped automatic. "We're in the middle of the leaves." Ethan continued faster now because the chirp was thinning. "They leave residue. Sticky. It transfers. Gloves, rails, toys." Elaine Whitmore stood abruptly. Her chair scraped the floor. "Richard," she said, not looking at her husband. "What is he talking about?" "Richard." Whitmore stared at Ethan like he was a miscalculation. "Who are you?" "Maintenance," Ethan said. "I fixed the East Wing breaker tonight." "That does not give you permission to diagnose my son." Richard snapped. "It's not a diagnosis," Ethan said. "It's exposure." The word landed oddly in the room, like a dropped instrument. A nurse frowned. Another doctor, younger, leaned closer to the crib and glanced at the windowsill without realizing why. Dr. Klein shook his head. Digitalis poisoning would show cardiac markers. "We don't have—" "You tested blood," Ethan said. "Not surfaces." "Security." Richard said, his patient's gone. "Now." Hands closed on Ethan's arms. Firm. Professional. The room tilted as they turned him toward the door. Ethan did not resist. He knew resistance would end the conversation. He let himself be moved, eyes locked on the plant, as it slid out of view behind the curtain. "Wait," Elaine said suddenly. Her voice cut through the noise. "Just wait." She stepped closer to Ethan. Up close, she looked older than the magazines ever showed. Lines around her mouth, red-rimmed eyes that had been crying too long. "You're saying a houseplant is killing my son." "I'm saying it's part of it," Ethan replied. "It's not airborne. It's contact. Slow, accumulative." Dr. Klein scoffed softly. "This is irresponsible." The baby's monitor stuttered. A nurse cursed under her breath. Someone said, "We're losing pressure." Elaine looked at Richard. If there's even a chance, Richard's jaw tightened. He looked at the doctors, at the machines, at his son, then back at Ethan. "You get one sentence," he said. "Make it count." Ethan swallowed. "Remove the plant and anything it touched," he said. "Wash the baby's hands and mouth. Don't operate until you rule it out." Silence. Thick, heavy. Dr. Klein opened his mouth, then closed it. "Fine," he said sharply. 2 minutes. Bag the plant. We test. If this is nonsense, he's gone." Security loosened their grip, but did not let go. The plant was removed quickly, almost angrily sealed in a clear bag like evidence. A nurse wiped the baby's hands, his lips the rail of the crib. The monitor did not miraculously recover. It did not flatline either. The chirp steadied just enough to be noticed. Dr. Klein frowned at the screen. That's odd. Ethan exhaled, slow, controlled. He had not fixed anything. Not yet. He had bought seconds. Move him to isolation, another doctor said. Clean room. Full environmental sweep. Richard nodded. Do it. The guard finally released Ethan. You, Richard said, pointing. Don't move. Ethan stood there as the room shifted into a new rhythm. Orders snapped. Wheels rolled. The baby was moved lines, trailing like fragile lifelines. Elaine followed hand over her mouth, whispering something Ethan could not hear. When the door closed, the noise fell away, leaving a strange quiet. Dr. Klein stared at Ethan. You realize, he said slowly, that if you're wrong. I know, Ethan replied. I know exactly what happens if I'm wrong. Klein studied him for a long moment, then turned away. Richard Whitmore remained. He did not thank Ethan. He did not threaten him either. My security chief will escort you, he said. You'll wait. Where Ethan asked, Richard hesitated. Here. Hours passed in a windowless room near the service corridor. The hum of ventilation, the smell of disinfectant. Ethan sat on a metal chair, hands clasped, replaying every second. His mother would be working tonight. She would hear something. She always did. The thought tightened his chest. The door opened. Not security this time. A woman in a grey suit stepped in. Tablet tucked under her arm. Late 50s. Calm eyes. I'm Carol Finch, she said. General Counsel. Ethan stood automatically. Am I in trouble? Not yet, Finch said. Sit. She took the other chair. Tell me exactly what you touched when you helped move that plant. Ethan answered. Slowly. Carefully. She asked about gloves, tools where he washed his hands, who else was there. She did not interrupt. When he finished, she nodded once and left. Time stretched again. When the door opened the second time, Elaine Whitmore stood there alone. She looked different. Straighter. Focused. He's stable, she said. The word seemed to cost her. Not out of danger, but stable. Ethan closed his eyes for a second. Good. Elaine watched him. You didn't panic, she said. Everyone else did. I panicked, Ethan replied. I just didn't show it. She almost smiled. Almost. Richard wants to see you. The study was large and quiet, walls lined with books Ethan recognized from titles he had dusted. Richard Whitmore stood by the window, hands behind his back, staring out at the dark lawn. The tests are positive, he said without turning. Surface contamination. Not enough to kill an adult. Enough to poison a baby over time. Ethan said nothing. We would have found it eventually. Richard continued, his voice tight. Yes, Ethan said. Eventually. Richard turned. The look on his face was not gratitude. It was calculation. Why do you know this? Ethan met his gaze. Because my grandmother taught me to look at what people touch. Richard studied him, then nodded once. You're not going home tonight. Ethan's stomach dropped. Am I being arrested? No, Richard said. You're being protected. From what Richard's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then back at Ethan. From whoever sent that plant, because that was not a mistake. The weight of that statement settled slowly. He had not stopped an accident. He had interrupted a plan. Outside, unseen by both of them, a black sedan idled at the edge of the estate, its engine running its headlights off. The security cameras caught the sedan at 3 different angles and still managed to miss the license plate. It sat just beyond the reach of the estate lights, engine humming low, patient, as if it belonged there. By the time a guard noticed it and called it in, the car was already moving, rolling away down the private access road, with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew no one would follow. Inside the house the mood had shifted, but the tension had not lifted. It had sharpened. Ethan sat at a small table in the security office, a paper cup of water cooling untouched in front of him. A guard stood by the door, not hostile, not friendly, just present. The television mounted in the corner showed a muted news channel ticker scrolling endlessly about markets and politics that felt suddenly unreal. Somewhere above him, a baby fought for his life, and somewhere beyond the gates, someone had tried to make sure that life ended quietly. Richard Whitmore entered without knocking. He closed the door himself. They wiped the plant, he said. Professional job. Whoever sourced it knew exactly what they were doing. Rare cultivar. Legal to purchase. Difficult to trace. Ethan nodded slowly. They didn't want it to look like murder. They wanted it to look like medicine failing, Richard replied. He pulled out a chair and sat the weight of the night visible in the set of his shoulders. 18 doctors. Every machine money can buy. And still my son would have died. Ethan's fingers tightened around each other. He's still not safe. No, Richard said. But he's alive. Silence stretched. The hum of the building pressed in. You understand? Richard continued, that what you did tonight puts you in danger. I understand, Ethan said. I understood before I opened the door. Richard studied him. Most people would have walked away. Most people weren't paying attention. That earned him a look. Not anger. Something closer to respect, though Richard would not have named it that yet. A knock interrupted them. Carol Finch stepped in her tablet, glowing faintly. We've got a match, she said. The vendor. Private botanical lab out of Oregon. Shell purchase through 3 intermediaries. Who paid? Richard said. Finch hesitated. It's not random. Richard stood. Who? A former board member, Finch said. Removed last year. Quietly. No criminal record. Plenty of motive. Ethan felt the room tilt again, that sense of the ground shifting beneath his feet. This was no longer about a plant or a mistake. This was a war fought with subtler weapons. They'll come for him, Finch said, glancing at Ethan, if they think he knows more than he does. I know enough, Ethan said. Richard turned sharply. What does that mean? It means, Ethan said carefully, that whoever planned this underestimated one thing. They thought everyone in this house would see the world the same way. Richard's phone buzzed again. He read the message, jaw tightening. "They're bringing in state police," he said. "And federal. This stops being private." "Now." "Good," Ethan said, "because private is how this almost worked." Richard looked at him, really looked at him, as if seeing him for the first time, not as staff, not as a liability, but as a variable he had not accounted for. "You're staying," he said, "under protection." Ethan shook his head. "My mother." "She's already here," Finch said. "Guest room. Safe." Relief hit him hard enough that he had to grip the edge of the table. "She doesn't know." "She knows you're alive," Finch said gently. "That's what matters right now." The hours that followed blurred together. Interviews, statements. Ethan repeated the same facts until they felt worn thin. Each time the questions edged closer to the same thing. How did you know? Why did you act? What made you think you had the right? He answered honestly. He did not dress it up. He did not claim heroism. He spoke about residue on leaves, about habits, about watching people touch things without thinking. At dawn, he was finally escorted upstairs, not tooled to a cell, not to an office, but to a small sitting room outside the pediatric wing. His mother stood when she saw him. She crossed the space between them in 3 strides and wrapped him in her arms, so tightly it hurt. "You scared me," she whispered into his shoulder. "You scared me half to death." "I know," Ethan said. "I'm sorry." She pulled back, hands on his face, searching for injuries. "You don't get to do that," she said fiercely. "You don't get to throw yourself into danger like that." "I didn't throw myself," Ethan said quietly. "I stepped in." She stared at him, then shook her head, tears slipping free. "You're just like your grandmother," she said. "Too brave for your own good." Across the room, Elaine Whitmore watched them. Samuel asleep against her chest. Small fingers curled reflexively. The baby's color was better. Not perfect. Better. Richard joined her. He did not interrupt. When Linda Brooks finally noticed them, she stiffened instinctively, shrinking. Richard spoke first. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, "thank you for raising a son who pays attention." Linda did not know what to do with that. She nodded once. Later, when the room had emptied again, Ethan sat alone by the window. Morning light crept across the lawn, revealing tire tracks where the sedan had waited. Erased now. Cleaned away. Carol Finch returned with a folder. "They're going to arrest him," she said. "The board member. Evidence is strong." Ethan nodded. "He won't be the last." No, Finch agreed. "But he'll be the first." She hesitated, then added, "There will be questions from the press, from the lawyers, from people who don't like the idea that a system failed. I'm used to people not liking what I represent," Ethan said. Finch studied him. "What do you represent?" Ethan thought about that. About the breaker panel. The residue. The door he had opened, knowing it might never close the same way again. "A blind spot," he said. The door at the end of the hall opened. A doctor stepped out, tired but smiling. "He's improving," she said. Slowly, but steadily. Elaine exhaled a sound that might have been a prayer. Richard caught Ethan's eye across the room. In that look was something unspoken. A promise, a warning, a shift in power that neither of them fully understood yet. Outside, the sun climbed higher. Inside, a fragile life held on. And somewhere between those two facts, a young man who had been invisible learned that once you step into the light, there is no going back. The arrest happened quietly just after sunrise, without sirens or cameras, as if the world itself were trying to pretend it had not come this close to something unforgivable. 2 unmarked vehicles rolled through the outer gate, while the estate still smelled of morning dew and disinfectant. Federal agents moved with practiced calm, speaking low, showing badges only when necessary. A man in a tailored coat was escorted into the back seat, without protest. No struggle, no shouting. Just a brief glance back at the house, calculating even now and then, the door closed. Inside the Whitmore estate woke to a new kind of noise. Phones rang. Lawyers arrived with leather portfolios and unreadable expressions. Staff moved carefully, speaking in murmurs, unsure which rules still applied. The house had always run on hierarchy and routine. That morning both felt unstable. Ethan sat in the same sitting room unchanged, as if the night had not rewritten his life. He had not slept. He watched the agents leave through the window, the gravel crunching beneath their tires, and felt a strange emptiness settle in his chest. Ending a threat did not feel like victory. It felt like the beginning of something heavier. Carol Finch joined him with 2 cups of coffee. She set one down without comment. "They're charging him," she said. "Attempted murder, conspiracy, enough to keep him occupied for a long time." Ethan nodded. "People like that don't stop." "No," Finch said. "They adapt." Across the hall, a door opened. Richard Whitmore stepped out, jacket on tie, loose eyes sharp despite the night. He looked like a man who had made decisions before breakfast and would make more before lunch. "You should go home," he said to Ethan. It sounded like an order softened into advice. Ethan shook his head. "My home is here." Richard studied him. "That may no longer be true." They walked together down a corridor Ethan had polished more times than he could count. The walls held framed photographs of deals closed, buildings raised, awards earned. Ethan saw them differently now, not as proof of greatness, but as proof of blind spots. In the pediatric wing, Samuel slept under careful watch. Machines hummed softly. A nurse adjusted a line, smiled faintly at Elaine Whitmore, and left. Elaine sat with her back straight, one hand resting lightly on the crib rail, afraid that too much pressure might tempt fate. "He opened his eyes this morning," she said, when she noticed them. "Just for a moment." Richard closed his eyes at that. When he opened them, something in his expression had shifted, resolve sharpened by gratitude and anger in equal measure. "We're not done," he said quietly. "This didn't happen in a vacuum." Elaine nodded. "The house, the staff, the routines, we trusted them because they were familiar." "And familiarity," Richard said, "is where complacency grows." He turned to Ethan. "Walk with me." They passed through the main hall, past the front door that had never opened for Ethan before last night. Sunlight spilled across the marble floor, bright and unforgiving. Outside, reporters gathered beyond the gates. Cameras poised, hungry for a story that could fit into a headline. In the study, Richard closed the door and gestured for Ethan to sit. He did not sit himself. He paced once, then stopped. "You understand," Richard said, "that this house is not a family home in the way most people use that word. It's a machine. It exists to protect a name, a legacy, a balance of power." Ethan met his gaze. "Machines break." "Yes," Richard said, "and when they do, people get hurt." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a folder. Not thick. Deliberate. "There are questions coming," he said. "From regulators, from shareholders, from people who would like to believe this was an isolated incident." Ethan waited. "I need someone who can see what others miss." Richard continued. "Not a consultant. Not another executive trained to confirm what we already believe. Someone inside the seams." Ethan's brow furrowed. "You're talking about me." "I am," Richard said. Ethan shook his head slowly. "I'm maintenance." "You were," Richard replied. "Last night you became something else." Ethan felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the sense of being moved without consent of a life redirected by someone else's will. "I didn't do this for a job." Richard held up a hand. "I know. And if you say no, that's the end of it. No retaliation. No strings." Silence stretched. Outside, a helicopter passed low, its sound briefly rattling the windows. "What are you really asking?" Ethan said. Richard's voice dropped. "I'm asking you to help me tear down the parts of this machine that nearly killed my son." The words landed heavy. Ethan thought of his mother asleep in a guest room, exhausted and afraid. He thought of the staff moving quietly, watching him with new eyes. He thought of the man in the back of the unmarked car, calculating until the last second. "I don't have your power," Ethan said. Richard's mouth curved into something that was not a smile. "You have something more dangerous. Perspective." By noon, the story broke. Not all of it. Enough. A baby. A billionaire. A poisoning attempt disguised as decor. The cameras multiplied. Commentators speculated. Experts spoke confidently about things they did not fully understand. Ethan watched from a side room as Richard stood at a podium beyond the gates. He spoke carefully, choosing words that admitted failure without surrendering control. He thanked the doctors. He acknowledged the investigation. He did not mention Ethan. Yet. Inside the house, the air shifted again. Staff whispered. A guard nodded at Ethan with something like respect. A housekeeper paused, met his eyes, and smiled. Small things. Dangerous things. That afternoon, Linda Brooks sat across from Carol Finch, hands folded, posture stiff. "My son is not a pawn," she said, her voice steady, despite the tremor beneath it. Finch nodded. "He won't be treated as one." "I've worked for this family a long time," Linda continued. "I know how quickly gratitude turns into inconvenience." Finch did not argue. "That's why we're putting protections in writing." When Ethan joined them, Linda reached for his hand. "You don't owe anyone anything," she said quietly. "I know," Ethan replied. He squeezed her hand. "I owe myself." As evening fell, the estate settled into a fragile calm. Samuel slept. The doctors rotated shifts. Security doubled patrols. The machine adapted. Ethan stood once more at the window, watching the lights flicker on across the grounds. He understood now that stepping into the light was not a moment. It was a process, one that demanded choices again and again. Behind him, Richard Whitmore watched silently. He had built empires by recognizing leverage. Tonight, he recognized something rarer. Once seen, it could not be unseen. The first threat arrived disguised as a compliment. It came in the form of an op-ed published before breakfast, written by a retired executive with an impressive resume and a habit of sounding reasonable. The headline praised transparency, applauded swift action, and gently questioned whether untrained individuals should ever be allowed to interfere in critical medical environments. Ethan read it on a tablet left unattended in the sitting room, and felt the temperature of the house drop by a degree. By mid-morning, the second threat followed. A call to Carol Finch from a regulator who wanted to know why an unauthorized person had accessed a restricted wing. The words were polite. The implication was not. Richard Whitmore watched both developments with the calm of someone who had survived worse. "This is how it always starts," he said, standing at the window as the grounds crew moved with deliberate care below. They try to reframe the story, turn courage into recklessness. Ethan leaned against the wall, arms folded. They want a scapegoat. "They want control," Richard replied. "A scapegoat is just a convenient tool." Ethan thought of the man who had been arrested, of the shell companies and the careful planning, of how close it had all come to working. Control only works if people are afraid to look closer. Richard turned. "Which is why I need you to stay." Ethan met his gaze. "On your terms," Richard did not answer immediately. He reached into his jacket and removed a slim folder. Inside were documents, neat and precise. Titles, authorizations, lines of responsibility that did not exist 2 days ago. On paper, Richard said, "This makes you a consultant. Temporary, advisory. No public announcement." And in reality, Ethan said. In reality, Richard replied, "You'll have access." The word hung between them. Access meant corridors Ethan had never walked, meetings he had never been invited to, information that moved markets and ruined lives. Ethan's phone vibrated. A message from his mother. "Are you okay?" He typed back, "I am." "Promise." "I'll stay," Ethan said. "But I decide where I look." Richard nodded once. That was never in question. The first meeting was not glamorous. A conference room with bad coffee and too many screens. Department heads filed in, some curious, some defensive, all alert. Ethan took a seat at the far end of the table, notebook. Open pen, still. "This is Ethan Brooks," Richard said without ceremony. "He's here to observe." A man in a tailored suit frowned. "Observe what exactly?" Us, Richard replied. The man's smile was thin. "With respect, this is sensitive material." "So is a child's life," Richard said. "Proceed." They did. Risk assessments, supply chains, vendor audits that looked impressive until Ethan started asking questions. Simple ones. Who cleans this? How often? What happens when schedules overlap? Why are these two departments assuming the other handles this step? The room shifted. Not dramatically. Subtly. A few people glanced at each other. Someone cleared their throat. "That's standard procedure," the suited man said. "Standard is how things slip through," Ethan replied. His tone was even. "Who checks when standard fails?" Silence, then murmurs, then resistance. By the end of the hour, Ethan's notebook held more than answers. It held patterns. Outside the room, Carol Finch caught up to him. "You're making people nervous." "I'm noticing what they don't like," noticed, Ethan said. She studied him. "You're not wrong. But you should know there's pressure building. Internally. Externally." From who, Ethan asked. "People who benefit from things staying just ambiguous enough," Finch said. "And people who think this ends with one arrest." Ethan thought of the black sedan. It never does. That afternoon, Richard announced a temporary freeze on all non-essential operations. The markets reacted immediately. Analysts speculated. Commentators frowned. Share prices dipped, then stabilized. The machine shuddered, but did not break. In the pediatric wing, Samuel opened his eyes again. This time, he focused. His tiny hand curled around Elaine's finger with surprising strength. She laughed and cried at once, the sound raw and unguarded. Richard watched from the doorway, his face unreadable. "He's a fighter," the nurse said softly. "So is the person who saved him," Elaine replied, glancing down the hall where Ethan stood, speaking quietly with his mother. Linda Brooks looked overwhelmed by the attention. A nurse thanked her. A doctor nodded respectfully. She accepted it all with caution, years of experience telling her that kindness in places like this often came with an expiration date. "You don't have to stay," she told Ethan later when they were alone. "Whatever you've done, it's enough." Ethan shook his head. "It's not done." "Be careful," she said. "People don't like mirrors." That evening, as the sun dipped low, a man Ethan did not recognize approached him near the side entrance. Mid-50s, expensive coat, polite smile that did not reach his eyes. "You've caused quite a stir," the man said. "Impressive." "Who are you?" Ethan asked. "Someone who appreciates efficiency," the man replied. "And discretion." Ethan felt the shift instantly. The subtle pressure. "I don't do side conversations." The man chuckled softly. "You will if you plan to survive this." Before Ethan could respond, security appeared. The man stepped back, hands raised in mock surrender. "We'll talk another time." "No," Ethan said. "We won't." The man's smile faded. He walked away without another word. Ethan reported the encounter. Carol Finch's expression hardened. "They're testing boundaries." "Let them," Ethan said. "I'm not invisible anymore." That night, Richard called a private meeting. Only 3 people attended. Richard, Carol Finch, Ethan. "I've reviewed the findings you flagged," Richard said. "They go deeper than I thought." "They always do," Ethan replied. Richard leaned back, steepling his fingers. "I built this company, believing that scale protected us. That complexity was a shield. You've shown me it's also a weakness." "What you do with that matters," Ethan said. Richard met his gaze. "I'm stepping down from operational control." The words landed with weight. Effective immediately, Richard continued. Interim leadership will handle the day-to-day. I'll focus on accountability. Carol Finch blinked. That will cause waves. It already has, Richard said. He turned to Ethan. And you. Ethan felt a familiar tightening. I didn't ask for... You didn't, Richard agreed. Which is why this works. He slid a document across the table. Ethan did not touch it yet. This makes you head of internal review, Richard said. Direct line to me. Independent authority. Temporary until the dust settles. Ethan stared at the paper. The irony was not lost on him. 2 days ago, he had been fixing a breaker panel. Now he was being handed power most people spent lifetimes chasing. I don't look like your executives, Ethan said quietly. Richard's voice was firm. That's the point. Outside, the estate lights flickered on one by one. Inside, a decision settled into place. Ethan picked up the document. In the quiet that followed, something fundamental shifted. Not just in the house, not just in the company, in the way power recognized itself. And somewhere deep in the machine, the blind spot closed. The leak came from inside the building, and it arrived before lunch. By 10:45 in the morning, every major outlet was running the same framing with minor variations. A poor black maintenance worker intervenes in medical crisis. Lines were drawn with care. Hero to some, liability to others. The phrase untrained interference appeared often enough to feel coordinated. Ethan read the headlines without reacting. His face still, his breathing slow. He had learned early that flinching gave at people something to use. Richard Whitmore did not read them at all. He watched the floor feeds instead, silent as analysts argued about optics and risk exposure. They're trying to make this about protocol, he said at last. Not intent, not motive. Carol Finch nodded. Protocol is safer. It keeps blame abstract. And abstract blame, Richard said, never goes to prison. Ethan closed his notebook. They don't want to talk about who ordered the plant. No, Finch said. They want to talk about who touched the baby. The meeting ended without ceremony. Ethan stepped into the hallway and felt the shift immediately. Conversations paused, resumed quieter. A woman he had never met looked at him with something like awe and something like fear. Power did that to rooms. It changed the air. At noon, state police arrived to conduct formal interviews. The questions were polite, precise. They circled the same axis again and again. Who authorized you? What training do you have? Did anyone instruct you to act? Ethan answered carefully. No one instructed me. I noticed something. I spoke up. I was ignored. I acted to prevent further harm. A detective leaned back. You understand how that sounds? Yes, Ethan said. It sounds inconvenient. The detective smiled thinly. It sounds reckless. Ethan met his eyes. So does poisoning a child with a houseplant. That line ended the interview. Outside, Linda Brooks waited with a cup of tea that had gone cold. She handed it to Ethan without speaking. Her presence grounded him more than any legal assurance could. They're not done, she said quietly. I know, Ethan replied. In the pediatric wing, Samuel's condition held. Stable. Fragile. Doctors spoke in measured tones, now chastened. The machines hummed with less urgency. Elaine Whitmore sat beside the crib and watched her son sleep like someone guarding a treasure that could vanish if she blinked. When Ethan entered, she looked up. "They're saying things about you," she said. "They always do," Ethan replied. She studied him. "You're not angry." "I am," Ethan said. "But anger is loud. I need quiet." That afternoon, the board convened by video. Faces filled the screens. Some were sympathetic, others calculating. One voice dominated smooth and reasonable, suggesting that extraordinary actions should not set dangerous precedents, that protecting the company required drawing firm lines. Ethan listened. Then he spoke. "You're discussing precedent," he said. "I'm discussing pattern." The room stilled. "Precedent asks what happens next time," Ethan continued. "Pattern asks why it happened this time. You're focused on stopping people like me from acting. You're not focused on stopping people like him from trying again." A man in a dark suit frowned. "This is not your place." "It became my place when your system failed," Ethan replied. Silence followed. Not agreement. Recognition. After the call ended, Richard exhaled. "You're going to make enemies." "I already have them," Ethan said. That evening, a package arrived without a return address. Security flagged it immediately. It contained nothing dangerous, just a note. Handwritten. "Careful script. You don't belong in rooms like this." Ethan read it once, then handed it to Finch. "They're escalating," he said. "They're afraid," Finch replied. "Fear makes people careless." Night fell hard and fast. Rain streaked the windows, blurring the estate lights into long, trembling lines. Ethan stood alone in the main hall, the space echoing with memory. He could still see himself polishing this floor, careful not to leave streaks. Invisible by design. Footsteps approached. Richard joined him, hands clasped behind his back. "When I was young," he said, "I believed competence was enough. That if you did things well, the world would make room." Ethan did not answer. "I was wrong," Richard continued. "The world makes room for power. Competence just decorates it." Ethan looked at him. "Power without conscience breaks things." Richard nodded. "Which is why conscience without protection gets crushed." They stood there as thunder rolled in the distance. Later that night, as the house slept in uneasy shifts, Ethan received a call from a blocked number. He answered without greeting. "You're moving too fast," a voice said. Male. Controlled. "You don't understand the scale you're playing on." "I understand enough," Ethan replied. "You think this is about a baby," the voice continued. "It's about control of supply chains that keep millions alive. You disrupt that people die." "People already died," Ethan said. "You just didn't count them." A pause. Then a laugh. "You're dangerous." "Yes," Ethan said. "To people like you." The line went dead. Ethan did not sleep after that. At dawn, Richard announced the formation of an independent oversight unit, with real authority, not cosmetic. Names were attached, processes outlined, timelines set. The markets reacted violently, then recalibrated. The machine resisted, then adapted. In a quiet corner of the estate, Linda Brooks watched her son speak with federal agents, with executives, with doctors, who once would not have met his eyes. Pride swelled in her chest, tempered by fear. She knew what visibility cost. When Ethan returned to her side, she squeezed his hand. "Promise me one thing," she said. What he asked, "Don't become them." Ethan nodded. "I won't." That afternoon, Samuel stirred and opened his eyes wide. He looked around, curious, unafraid. When Ethan leaned closer, the baby's gaze locked onto his face. A small hand reached out, grasped Ethan's finger with surprising strength. Elaine laughed softly. "He knows you." Ethan felt something in his chest loosen, just a fraction. "He's strong," he said. "So are you," Elaine replied. Outside, the rain cleared. The sky broke open into a pale, honest blue. Cameras gathered beyond the gates. Questions waited. The story was far from over. Ethan stepped toward the light without rushing, without apology. Once you see how the world really works, you don't get to look away. The injunction hit just before noon, delivered with the quiet brutality of a faxed order and a court seal that carried more weight than any threat spoken out loud. All internal reviews were to be paused, all communications centralized, all unauthorized personnel barred from operational oversight, pending further evaluation. Ethan read the document twice, then a third time. Not because he did not understand it, but because he wanted to be certain there was no mistake. It was clean, precise, legal language sharpened to a blade. Someone had moved faster than expected. Carol Finch did not bother to hide her reaction. "They went to a friendly judge," she said. "Emergency jurisdiction. Claimed risk of corporate destabilization." Richard Whitmore stood at the window, unmoving. "They're framing accountability as sabotage." "Yes," Finch said. "And you?" She looked at Ethan as the spark. Ethan nodded once. "Then this is where it gets real." Within minutes, the atmosphere inside the estate shifted again. Not fear this time. Calculation. Phones rang with a different tone. Executives who had nodded along the day before now avoided eye contact. Doors that had been open were suddenly closed. Ethan walked the corridors anyway. He did not knock. He did not ask permission. He stopped outside offices and listened. He watched body language. The tightening of shoulders. The way people lowered their voices when they thought power was nearby. He had lived his entire life reading rooms from the edges. Now the edges were everywhere. In a glass-walled conference room, two senior managers spoke in low voices. "He doesn't belong here," one said. "He's temporary," the other replied. "This will blow over." Ethan stepped inside. The conversation died mid-sentence. "Temporary problems still leave permanent damage," Ethan said calmly, "especially when ignored." Neither man answered. He did not wait for them to. By mid-afternoon, the media narrative hardened. The hero language faded, replaced by words like overreach and risk. A former regulator appeared on television, shaking his head, warning against emotional decision-making in complex systems. The camera loved him. He looked reassuring. Linda Brooks watched from a small lounge, arms crossed tightly. "They're turning it," she said. "Just like I told you." "I know," Ethan replied. "That means we're close." Close to what she asked, to the truth they don't want discussed. In the pediatric wing, Samuel slept peacefully, oblivious to the war unfolding around him. His breathing was steady, now his color warm. Elaine Whitmore sat nearby, scrolling through headlines with growing anger. "They're talking about everything except the poison," she said. "Except the man who ordered it." "They always do," Ethan replied. "Systems protect themselves first." Elaine looked at him. "Then how do you break it?" Ethan met her gaze. "You don't break it from the outside." Richard Whitmore convened a private meeting that evening. No board members, no lawyers, just 3 people in a room built for decisions that changed lives. "They're trying to isolate you," Richard said to Ethan. "If you fight this head-on, they'll bury you in procedure." Ethan leaned forward. "Then we don't fight it. Head-on." Finch's eyes narrowed. "What are you thinking?" "The injunction freezes formal authority," Ethan said. "Not information, not people, not memory." Richard was silent for a long moment. "You want to go around the system. I want to remind it." Ethan replied that it's made of humans. The plan formed without theatrics, quietly, intentionally. No emails, no paper trail. Conversations held in person, doors closed, phones left outside. Ethan spoke to nurses first, then orderlies, then junior analysts who had flagged anomalies months ago and been told to let it go. Patterns emerged, always did. Vendors with unusually clean records, audits performed by the same outside firm year after year. Safety complaints rerouted, softened, delayed until urgency evaporated. None of it illegal on its own. Together, unmistakable. At 9 that night, Ethan sat alone in the security office, screens glowing around him. Footage played silently. Deliveries, hallways, hands touching surfaces, faces that lingered too long, that moved too confidently where they should not have. A knock came at the door. A guard stepped in, uneasy. "There's someone here to see you." "Who?" Ethan asked. The guard hesitated. "He says you know him." Ethan's stomach tightened. "Bring him." The man who entered wore no suit this time. Jeans, plain jacket, older than Ethan remembered, less polished. His eyes, however, were the same. "You don't quit," the man said. "You don't either," Ethan replied. They stared at each other across the room. Power shifted, subtle and sharp. "You're causing damage," the man said. "Not just to us, to people who depend on these systems." People depended on them before Ethan replied. They just didn't know the cost. The man stepped closer. "You think this ends with exposure? It doesn't. It ends when you're discredited, or exhausted, or gone." Ethan did not move. "You already tried gone." A flicker crossed the man's face. Gone, as in erased, as in buried under narrative and process. "This is bigger than you," the man said. "Yes," Ethan agreed. "That's why it matters." Security entered at Ethan's nod. The man was escorted out without resistance, his jaw tight, his confidence shaken just enough to notice. Later, as the estate settled into uneasy quiet, Ethan stood on the balcony overlooking the grounds. The lights below traced paths he knew by heart. Paths he used to walk unseen. Richard joined him, the injunction papers folded in his hand. "They'll escalate again," he said. "So will we," Ethan replied. Richard studied him. You understand what they'll try next? They'll come after my credibility, Ethan said. My past, my mother. Anything they can reach. Richard's voice was firm. That won't happen. Ethan shook his head. It will. And we let it. Richard turned sharply. We do not sacrifice people. We don't, Ethan said. We expose how they try. Silence fell between them heavy, but not hostile. In the distance, thunder rolled again, low and warning. A storm building not in the sky, but in rooms where decisions were made without faces attached. Inside the house, a baby slept. Inside the system, something stirred. Ethan rested his hands on the railing, steady. This was no longer about saving one life. It was about deciding which lives the system was willing to risk, and who finally said no. The credibility attack did not arrive as a single blow. It arrived in layers timed and polished, each one designed to feel reasonable on its own. By 8:30 in the morning, a background piece circulated quietly among reporters. Ethan Brooks had no formal medical training. Ethan Brooks had bypassed protocol. Ethan Brooks had acted independently. The tone was neutral. The implication was not. By noon, a second story followed this one warmer, more personal. A profile of Linda Brooks, devoted mother, long-time employee, loyal to a fault. It framed her love as motive. Maternal fear as recklessness by proxy. Ethan read both without comment. He closed the tablet and slid it across the table to Carol Finch. They're building a narrative ladder, he said. Each rung feels harmless until you see the height. Finch nodded. They're laying the groundwork to argue negligence. Maybe worse. And they'll do it while smiling. Ethan replied. Richard Whitmore entered the room carrying a folded newspaper, the ink still fresh. They're pushing for a public hearing, he said. Not about the poisoning, about governance, oversight, whether emotion compromised judgment. Elaine Whitmore followed him in jaw tight. They're erasing my son, she said, turning him into a footnote. Ethan met her eyes. Then we don't let them. The injunction still held. Formal channels remained frozen, but something else had shifted. Nurses spoke more freely. Junior staff shared notes they had never shared before. A systems analyst from procurement slipped Ethan a flash drive with a single sentence written on a sticky note. You should see this. In a quiet room with no windows, Ethan watched the data scroll past. Vendor histories, audit timestamps, patterns too consistent to be coincidence. The same outside firm clearing the same suppliers, the same delays, the same language reused, softened, filed away. This isn't just about one man, Finch said softly. It's an ecosystem. Yes, Ethan replied, and ecosystems collapse when enough people stop pretending they don't see the rot. By mid-afternoon, a subpoena arrived for Linda Brooks. A request, technically, worded politely. It asked about her employment, her son's access, her conversations the night of the incident. Linda read it twice, then folded it carefully. They want me to blink, she said. Ethan's chest tightened. We'll respond through counsel. She shook her head. No. I'll respond directly. Ethan looked at her. Mom. They're counting on fear, Linda said. I've lived with fear my whole life. I know its shape. If I hide, they win. Richard stepped forward. We'll protect you. Linda met his gaze steadily. I'm not asking to be protected. I'm asking to be heard. That evening, the Whitmore estate opened its gates for the first time since the crisis. Not to reporters, to staff, maintenance, housekeeping, security. People who knew the building the way surgeons knew anatomy. They gathered in the great hall, unsure why they had been called. Richard stood at the front, not behind a podium, not elevated. I built this place to be efficient, he said. I built it to run smoothly. I failed to ask who paid the price for that smoothness. Murmurs rippled through the room. I am asking you now, Richard continued to speak, about anything you saw, anything you questioned, anything that didn't feel right. Silence followed. Heavy. Then a woman stepped forward. A cleaner who had worked nights for 20 years. Her voice shook, but she did not stop. We reported spills, she said. Residue, strong smells. We were told it was nothing. Another voice joined, then another. A guard, a gardener, a junior administrator. Each story small on its own. Together, damning. Ethan listened, his jaw set. This was the map he had been building in his head. The negative space between rules. The next morning, Linda Brooks sat under oath in a small wood-paneled room. No cameras, just a recorder, and a man who smiled too often. Mrs. Brooks, he said, did you encourage your son to intervene in the medical care of the Whitmore child? No. Linda replied. I encouraged my son to pay attention. Did you know he would act without authorization? I knew he would act if someone was in danger. The man leaned back. Do you believe your son knows better than trained professionals? Linda met his gaze. I believe my son knows what he sees. That clip leaked by evening. Not the whole testimony. Just that line. It spread faster than any legal filing. By nightfall, the pressure reached Richard directly. Calls from donors, from colleagues, from people who had stood beside him for decades. Some urged caution, others urged silence. A few threatened consequences. Richard listened. Then he made his decision. At 9 o'clock, he authorized the release of internal documents. Not all of them. Enough. Emails, audit summaries, vendor approvals, names redacted where necessary, patterns left intact. The response was immediate. Analysts pivoted. Journalists recalibrated. The conversation shifted from rogue intervention to systemic failure. Ethan watched the coverage from the same window he had stood by nights before. The estate lights glowed steady. Beyond the gates, vans gathered, antennas raised. This will get ugly, Finch said. It already is, Ethan replied. Now it's honest. A final message arrived just before midnight. No sender, just words. You've crossed the line, Ethan typed back without hesitation. There was never a line. Only people pretending there was. He set the phone down and breathed out slowly. Somewhere upstairs, Samuel slept, his small chest rising and falling, unaware of the storm his survival had unleashed. Ethan knew the next move would not be legal or public. It would be personal. And he was ready. The call came at 2:12 in the morning, and it did not ring twice. Ethan answered without checking the number. "I'm listening." "You shouldn't be," the voice said. It was calm, older, educated. The kind of voice that had never needed to raise itself. "You're making decisions you don't understand." Ethan sat on the edge of the guest room bed, shoes still on jacket folded beside him. The house was quiet in the way large houses become quiet, a hush built on distance and money. "I understand enough," he said. "That's why you're calling now." A pause. "This ends badly for people like you." "It already ended badly," Ethan replied. "You just didn't expect me to survive." The line went dead. Ethan did not move for a long moment. He listened to the house breathe, the faint click of pipes, the distant hum of security vehicles repositioning outside. He had learned to read danger, not by noise, but by absence, and something had gone very still. By morning, the silence broke. A subpoena arrived for Ethan himself. Broad, aggressive. It requested communications notes, any material related to his activities since the incident. The phrasing was careful, but the intent was clear. If they could not discredit him in public, they would exhaust him in private. Carol Finch skimmed the document, jaw set. "They're fishing. They want me busy," Ethan said. "Distracted. Or scared," Finch added. Ethan looked past her toward the window. Dawn spread pale and thin across the lawn. "I'm not." Richard Whitmore convened the oversight unit before breakfast. No formal agenda, just truth laid bare. The documents released the night before had started a chain reaction. Other companies distanced themselves. Regulators sharpened their language. The man at the center of it all had become a liability no one wanted to defend publicly. Still, defense was happening. Quietly. In hallways and side rooms and calls placed just off the record. "They'll try to force you into a corner," Richard said to Ethan. "Make this about you versus the institution." Ethan shook his head. "We don't give them that shape." How Finch asked. "By making it about evidence," Ethan replied. "And timing." He pulled a flash drive from his pocket and placed it on the table. The procurement analyst who came forward. She wasn't the first, just the bravest. There are 3 more. They didn't want their names released, but they kept copies. Finch's eyes widened. Of what? Of approvals that never should have cleared, Ethan said. Of audits marked complete that weren't. Of emails that contradict sworn statements. Richard leaned back, exhaled slowly. "If we release this, they'll call it retaliation," Finch said. "They already are," Ethan replied. "This just makes it harder to lie." The decision was made without a vote. By noon, the documents hit. Not as a dump, as a narrative. Carefully sequenced, context provided, timelines aligned. The effect was immediate and brutal. News anchors stopped hedging. Analysts stopped smiling. The word conspiracy entered the conversation, not shouted but spoken with increasing certainty. By mid-afternoon, a familiar black sedan appeared again at the edge of the estate. This time it did not idle. It drove straight to the gate and stopped. Security locked down instantly. Agents moved. Radios crackled. Ethan watched from an upper window as a man stepped out. Hands visible. Posture relaxed. He carried no briefcase, no folder. Just confidence. Richard joined him. He wants to be seen. Yes, Ethan said, which means he wants to control the frame. The man was escorted inside under watchful eyes. In the study, he stood across from Richard and Ethan, surveying the room like an old general returning to a battlefield he once commanded. "You've made this very public," the man said. "That was unwise." "You tried to kill a child," Richard replied coldly. The man smiled thinly. "I tried to protect a system," Ethan spoke. "By poisoning a baby, collateral," the man said. "Tragic, but acceptable." Silence fell. Heavy. Final. "You won't win," the man continued. "Not really. Institutions outlast outrage. People forget." Ethan met his gaze. "People remember when you show them how close it came." The man's eyes flicked to Ethan, something like recognition flashing there. "You think you're untouchable now?" "No," Ethan said. "I think you are." Sirens sounded in the distance, not rushed. Certain. Carol Finch entered badge, visible, flanked by agents. "You're under arrest," she said. Again. Federal charges, expanded. The man's smile faltered. Just for a moment. Then it returned brittle. "This isn't over." "It is for you," Finch replied. As he was led away, the man glanced back at Ethan. "You could have stayed invisible," he said softly. "You chose otherwise." Ethan did not respond. The arrest broke the dam. Within hours, other names surfaced. Executives resigned. Consultants vanished from public view. A firm that had audited half the industry for a decade quietly announced it would cease operations pending review. The system did not collapse. It convulsed. In the pediatric wing, Samuel woke and cried strong and loud. The sound cut through the noise of breaking news and ringing phones like a declaration. Elaine Whitmore laughed through tears as she lifted her son, pressing her face to his hair. "He's hungry," she said. "Can you believe that?" Richard watched from the doorway, the lines in his face deeper now, etched by consequence. He turned to Ethan. "This ends tonight," he said. Ethan shook his head. "This phase does." Richard nodded. "You'll testify?" "Yes." "You'll be attacked?" "Yes." And afterward, Richard said carefully, "There will be no going back." Ethan thought of his mother, of the floor he used to polish, of the first time he had opened a door he was never meant to touch. "I wasn't planning to go back," he said. That evening, Linda Brooks sat with him in the quiet of the guest room. She held his hands the way she had when he was small, grounding him. "I'm proud of you," she said. "And I'm scared." "Me too," Ethan admitted. She smiled softly. "That means you're still human." Outside, cameras waited. Tomorrow, Ethan would speak under oath. Tomorrow, the story would reach its peak. Tonight, the house was still. And for the first time since the heart monitor had gone quiet, Ethan slept. The hearing room smelled like old wood, polished metal, and restraint. Ethan sat at the witness table with his hands folded, shoulders relaxed, posture steady. No suit tailored to impress. No attempt to disappear either. Just a clean jacket, pressed shirt, and the quiet certainty of someone who had already survived the worst part. Across the room, cameras waited behind a thin line of rules. Officials filled the benches. Lawyers shuffled papers they already knew by heart. This was not a trial meant to decide guilt. That had been decided elsewhere. This was about record, about narrative, about who history would say acted responsibly when a system failed. The oath was administered. Ethan repeated the words without hesitation. When the first question came, it was predictable. Credentials, training, authority. "You had no medical license," the attorney said evenly. Ethan replied, "You had no formal authorization to intervene." "No." Murmurs rippled softly. The attorney leaned forward. "Then explain why you believed it was appropriate to act." Ethan did not rush. He looked past the table, past the officials, past the cameras, to a point somewhere behind them where his mother sat. Linda Brooks met his eyes and nodded once. "I believed," Ethan said, "that when a system designed to protect life is actively failing responsibility, shifts to whoever sees the danger clearly enough to stop it." Silence followed. Not approval. Not outrage, attention. The attorney tried again. "So you decided you knew better than 18 trained doctors?" "No," Ethan said. "I decided they were looking in the wrong direction." The line landed harder than any accusation. Over the next hour, Ethan spoke about patterns, about residue, about how people touch railings, toys, gloves, and then forget they did. He spoke about how experts vision as often as it expands it. He did not insult the doctors. He did not elevate himself. He described the gap, the blind spot. When the opposing counsel shifted tactics, the tone sharpened. "Isn't it true," the attorney said, "that you have since been given authority and access by Mr. Whitmore?" "Yes," Ethan said. "And isn't it possible that your testimony today is influenced by that relationship?" Ethan paused, then nodded. "It is influenced by consequence." The room leaned in. "My access did not create the evidence," he continued. "It revealed it. If that makes people uncomfortable, that discomfort belongs to the system, not to me." The attorney sat back. No follow-up. When Ethan stepped down, the room did not erupt. It did not need to. Something had shifted. The story was no longer about a reckless young man. It was about a quiet failure that almost stayed quiet forever. Outside the building, daylight cut sharp and clean. Reporters shouted names. Questions overlapped. Ethan did not stop. He walked until Richard Whitmore fell into step beside him. "You did exactly what you needed to do," Richard said. Ethan nodded. "Now comes the part where people decide what to do with it." They did. Within days, oversight reforms were announced. Not cosmetic, structural. Independent audits with rotating firms. Whistleblower protections written in plain language. Environmental risk protocols rewritten from the ground up. Other companies followed reluctantly at first, then publicly. No one wanted to be next. The man who had orchestrated the poisoning pleaded not guilty, The evidence disagreed. The trial would take time, years likely. But the record was already set. At the Whitmore estate, life began to move forward. Samuel went home. The first time Ethan saw him without wires, without monitors, without that thin line between breath and silence, something inside him finally loosened. The baby kicked and gurgled, unimpressed by the gravity of the room. Elaine Whitmore laughed. "He likes you," she said. "He always calms down." Ethan smiled, small and genuine. "He just knows I pay attention." Richard watched them from the doorway, hands in his pockets, the weight of his decisions visible but no longer crushing. "I spent my life building walls," he said quietly. "Turns out, the most dangerous things come wrapped as gifts." Ethan looked around the room. The light, the quiet, the ordinary miracle of a child breathing freely. "Walls don't keep danger out," he said. "They keep warnings from getting in." Linda Brooks arrived a moment later, carrying a small bag she had packed herself. She looked at her son. Really looked at him as if seeing him for the first time in a new light. "You're different," she said. "I'm the same," Ethan replied. "I'm just visible now." That visibility changed things. Not overnight. Not without cost. Ethan declined offers that came too fast and asked for time where it mattered. He accepted a role that came with limits, not power. Independent review, fixed term, clear boundaries. He insisted on language anyone could understand. If a rule could not be explained to a maintenance worker, it did not belong in the system. Some executives resented him. Others learned from him. A few quietly thanked him years later, when their own blind spots were caught before becoming disasters. Ethan moved out of the guest room, not into luxury, into a small place of his own, close enough to walk far enough to breathe. Linda kept her job, but not out of loyalty, out of choice. She spoke up more. People listened. The headlines faded as headlines do. What remained were changes you could not photograph. Checklists rewritten, questions asked earlier. A pause before assumption, a hand wiped clean before touching something fragile. One evening, months later, Ethan stood alone outside the estate gates, watching the lights come on across the grounds. The same paths, the same doors. Nothing looked different unless you knew where to look. He did. The world had not been saved. Systems rarely were. But one had been forced to look at itself without flinching. That mattered. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you that attention can be a form of courage, and that ordinary people see what powerful systems miss, then take a moment to like this story, subscribe for more, and leave a comment with 3 words that matter to you. Your voice matters.